The last millennium has seen a world shaped by waves of change at a blistering pace. But there is one nation which, perhaps more than any other, has been witness to 1,000 years of explosive drama, all concealed behind an iron curtain of intrigue and mystery. Russia.
Russia has always had to invent history to legitimate itself when the real story was not palatable.
So what is the real truth behind mighty Mother Russia and her hidden past? It's a story that takes us from its earliest leaders to its most notorious.
Stalin proves that, let's face it, the 20th century was the perfect century for dictators.
And on to its leader today.
Vladimir Putin is a man with a mission. His goal has been to make Russia great again.
It's the story of its proud people and the demands of their motherland, from bloody revolution to a regime that demands loyalty at any cost.
The knock on the door at 3 in the morning, someone in your apartment block is being dragged away by the secret police.
Maybe because he was very close to some truth was the last drop, and he was killed.
From a mighty superpower to an empire on the brink of collapse.
This was really a disaster that nobody had ever seen before and never really imagined at this scale.
And now to a new global threat.
Despite all the obstacles that have been posed over the years, Russia still is such an enormous player on the world stage.
There's such a wealth of opinions on what Russia is, what it should be.
The real victims in this game, in this drama, are Russians.
It's a melting pot of every single political system you could think of.
This is the epic story of one of the biggest and most extraordinary countries on the planet. Churchill once described Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. And so it remains today.
In every sort of major modern period of Russian history, I mean, there have been significant barriers to actually knowing what's happening inside the country.
We know this is a country of proud people who have a remarkable relationship with their motherland.
This idea of what Russia is, where it belongs, it's been something that's been discussed in the country, publicly, in literature, in politics, really all through time.
And yet, in the West, we are almost conditioned not to trust its leaders.
Our quarrel is with Putin's Kremlin.
Whether we like it or not, Russia appears to play a part in all our lives. But why? How do you begin to unwrap this mystery? For some, the key is surprisingly simple. Look at the map. Russia's place in the world is staggering. This has been a country that has always been pushing outwards. It covers 1/8 of all the land on Earth, stretching across the whole of Northern Asia and the eastern third of Europe.
One thing that I find endlessly fascinating is how much more there is to Russia, and I suppose the challenge of ruling over that vast landmass.
And when you start to dig down into the sheer range of landscapes, peoples, and culture all under one Russian flag, it becomes all the more extraordinary. 70 times bigger than the UK, Russia is so vast that when the sun rises in the west, at the same time it's setting in the east, over 11 time zones away.
This is a country that spans half the globe. It covers from the incredibly fun, metropolitan, 24/7 capital that is Moscow, which is a rich, prosperous European city, all the way through to much, much more impoverished backwater villages.
Over the last 1,000 years, much of Russia's vast wilderness has remained unchanged. Even back to the moment that Russia was little more than a loose confederation of tribes, ruled over by her patron saint, the Grand Prince Vladimir. At the turn of the century, the Grand Prince had been in power for 20 years and ruled over a kingdom known as Kievan Rus, which had emerged after the conquest of the Rus Vikings.
The Rus were this whole selection of different individual principalities and city-states, most of which had very little power.
It's seen as being the cradle of Russian civilization and something that joins Slavic peoples together.
From the grand capital, which then was Kiev, Vladimir was to leave a lasting legacy on Russia, one which still plays a key part in Russian life today.
Vladimir imposed Christianity quite literally at the point of a spear on his own people who were driven into the rivers in Kiev to be baptized. This allowed him precisely to be able to assert that Kiev was not just the biggest, most splendid city of the Rus, but it was the heart of the new Rus Christianity.
It is a core part of Russia 1,000 years on. Today, it is estimated over 70% of Russians identify as Orthodox Christian. And like the Grand Prince, President Putin professes a deep Orthodox belief. This is a man who also believes the story of Russia that followed its founding father has been grossly distorted by the West. And he pointed to one of Russia's most divisive rulers as a case in point. A man who, centuries on from the sacred Grand Prince, would defeat the Mongol invaders and transform Russia from a medieval state into a vast empire. The man who first made Russia great. You just wouldn't want to argue with him.
There is a very strong myth within Russia itself that what they need is a strong hand. There are many leaders of Russia and the Soviet Union who would qualify as such.
And none more so than Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible, who was to become the first Tsar of Russia, and he certainly earned his name.
The degree of ruthlessness with which Ivan dealt with any perceived threat to himself was actually quite phenomenal. This is a period in which you have enemies being dealt with, whether they're being impaled in the center of Moscow or sewn into the skin of a bear and have the Tsar's hunting dogs unleashed upon them. He regards brutality as being one of the central attributes of being a strong ruler.
The Tsar was important, he was master of everything. Everybody else could be easily punished by him.
Even when he was 15, he had his kennelmen take one of the great boyars who had been a particular power in the land and beat him to death. This is a guy who, even at 15, was beginning to realize the power that came with his title.
Ivan the Terrible's reputation in Russia is a good symptom of the distinctive way in which Russians see strong leaders who terrorize them.
And yet, while he may have been terrible, this was a strong leader who would change Russia forever.
This is a man who established the first real standing army and then used it to fight off previous aggressors to the south, the Khanate of Kazan, for example. This is the man who started the inexorable eastward sweep of Russian expansion across Siberia. This is also the period in which actually, for a while, Ivan creates a whole kingdom within a kingdom.
Under Ivan's tyrannical rule, Russia established itself as a vast empire, and at its very epicenter was Moscow.
I mean, Ivan is recognized as the monarch who established Muscovy, Moscow, the symbolism of we are here to stay and this is a fortress, and people often talk about Russia as a fortress.
Ivan created a capital built around power, around a leader and around fear. This was an autocracy under an iron fist, and in doing so, he was to begin a Tsardom, which would grip Russia for centuries to come and steer her towards an explosive entrance onto the world stage. Russia. How, over the last 1,000 years, did this sprawling rural country rise up the global pecking order to become a superpower? It's an epic tale that would see the Russian people dominated by a roll call of some of history's most notorious rulers, but perhaps none more so than her almighty Tsars. A dynasty of 18 Romanovs would take to the Russian throne over 300 years, and each would leave their mark. But three in particular, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and Nicholas II, would leave legacies so seismic that they still define the people and the great cities of Russia today. This is one of the tallest statues ever created, weighing in at a hefty 600 tons. It's regularly voted one of the ugliest statues in the world. Meet Peter the Great. If you're in Moscow, you can't miss him. This was a man determined for Russia to start looking outwards.
Peter the Great is always hailed as one of the great Russian modernizers. He wasn't interested in the spiritual side of being a Tsar. He wasn't interested in the philosophical side of being a Tsar. He was interested in practicalities.
By the time Peter the Great became Tsar, Russia was the largest country in the world, stretching from Europe to the Pacific Ocean. His was a country of 14 million Russians, many of whom worked the land to survive. Peter wanted Russia to catch up, and he was convinced the West had all the answers. He'd even lived for 4 months in Deptford, London, to learn shipbuilding. He wanted a Russia that could mirror its great armies, equal its maritime might, even one that could follow European education and fashion. And he wanted a brand new capital to prove it.
He didn't like Moscow. They wanted a new city, and one that absolutely would look like a Western European city.
Moscow was out, and a new capital city, St. Petersburg, was born. It was to be Russia's window on Europe.
St. Petersburg, in my view, looks even now much better than Moscow.
St. Petersburg is a very beautiful city. It's a city that's associated with that period around its foundation. Enlightenment ideals, progressiveness, education, all of these general themes are kind of associated with the city. It's basically seen as Russia's cultural capital. Yet it was built on the backs of slaves who lost their lives.
Built on an inhospitable swamp, this is known as the city built on bones. Historians believe under its foundations are the remains of some 100,000 skeletons of the press-ganged slave laborers drawn from the length and breadth of the then Russian Empire. This vast and gruesome enterprise gives some idea of the ambition and the single-mindedness of the man behind it.
He brought in foreign architects and stonemasons and engineers from Italy, from Britain, from Germany, from the Netherlands. And they built in this beautiful, modern, airy city.
Peter the Great was one of the Russian leaders who has gripped this perpetual problem of Russia being behind the West, particularly Europe, recognizing that Russia was drifting further and further into irrelevance and seeking to do something about it, particularly by emulating the West.
It's seen as the source of great progress, of opening up opportunities for Russia and of establishing Russia on an equal footing with the great powers of Europe. I think that's why his period is seen as significant, because it really puts Russia on the map as a genuine global great power.
So it's perhaps no surprise that President Putin recently claimed that the man who founded the city he was born in was his favorite leader. Just like Putin the Great, Peter was a man astride an empire who wanted to expand Russia's influence and power. And everything about his St. Petersburg was designed to have that impact, especially the Grand Winter Palace, which is now home to one of the most important and biggest museums in the world. This is the Hermitage Museum. It holds 3 million works of art, which means if you looked at each artwork for a minute, you'd be there for nearly 6 years. The walls, which are now home to priceless works of art, were once home to the Russian royal family for almost 200 years. And all this started out as a private art collection for one person, the next great leader to make their mark on Russia, Catherine the Great. Whilst Putin may encourage comparisons with Peter, many think that Catherine the Great would be nearer the mark. Like Putin, Catherine was an unexpected ruler who would go on to become one of the greatest in its history. The woman whom history would remember as Catherine the Great wasn't actually called Catherine, and she wasn't even Russian. She was born Princess Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a German backwater in what was then the Holy Roman Empire. At the age of 16, she married the heir to the Russian throne, Peter III. But by 1762, she had seized power in a daring coup and became Empress of Russia. And her husband was secretly murdered.
She's seen as someone who's quite ruthless in disposing of her husband to take power.
One of the greatest female rulers of her age, Catherine's reputation would come under sustained attack from that moment on. Was she the promiscuous usurper or a modernizing force with the interests of her adopted nation at heart?
She was writing letters to Voltaire and getting letters from him. She was very civilized and she did have a lot of lovers.
Certain stories about her are myths, but it's fairly well documented that she did have various lovers, and this was not actually unusual. Throughout history, monarchs have taken lovers. It tends to be talked about more if they are women monarchs.
The shape of Russia grew under her rule. Some 200,000 square miles were added, including what's now Poland, Crimea, Lithuania, and Belarus.
Russia has always seen itself as a superpower, but it's under the reigns of Peter and subsequently Catherine that Europe first started to be seriously alarmed about its power and particularly about its intentions.
I think that it was pretty glorious period in Russian history.
This is a period in which Russia was actually consolidating its military force. It was continuing its pressure against the Ottoman Empire. And so what's really interesting is in this period you have a very, very distinct change in how the outside world, how Europe rather, looks at Russia. Catherine's triumph was how people thought about Russia and the extent to which they believed it had changed. And in politics, perception is everything.
She is generally talked about as being an enlightened autocrat, somebody who was obsessed with the West, with improving the ways in which Russian autocrats ruled.
But I do not know any leader staying in power for 20, 30 and more years was becoming better than he used to be or she used to be initially. And I think Catherine the Great is a good example of this.
And yet, for the everyday Russian, whilst Catherine may have brought enlightenment for the aristocracy, they were still trapped in a system of serfdom. And for the following century, across a dynasty of the 6 Tsars to follow, little would change in terms of the hardship and poverty of the Russian people. This was still a country whose population was made up overwhelmingly of peasants, and the Tsars wielded their considerable power over a vast empire that extended across 3 continents. By the 19th century, this autocratic way of running a country was increasingly out of step with its people. In the cities, the workers suffered appalling exploitation and squalor, and its countryside was in turmoil after a devastating famine. It was amidst this volatile cocktail of hunger and unrest that a new Tsar took power, Nicholas II. His legacy would change Russia forever.
These are the last pictures of this unhappy man and his family.
This is the Alexander Palace. Having fallen into disrepair, the favorite residence of the last Tsar, Nicholas II, has finally been restored. It is the symbol of a lost era. Nicholas was born here in 1868, the heir to a dynasty that had ruled over Russia for 250 years. When his father, Alexander III, died suddenly in 1894, a 26-year-old Nicholas stepped in. To his cousin, he confessed, "I am not prepared to be Tsar. I never wanted to become one. I know nothing of the business of ruling."
Part of the reason that he struggled in the role as Tsar was because he was completely unprepared for it. And I think this is really reflected in the way he essentially kind of continued without any real attempts to engage with the social trends that were emerging in that country until it was really far too late.
With Nicholas II, they have arguably one of the least fitted individuals to be leading Russia at a time of extraordinary turmoil.
The peasants were still in many ways tied to a very unfair system in which they did not own the land. Urban living standards were very low, but cities were becoming increasingly overcrowded.
Nicholas understood little of modern Russia and its ever more educated, urban and agitated society. They were on a collision course that would come to a head on the infamous Bloody Sunday.
The essence of the 1905 Bloody Sunday massacre is that it came out of a loyal petition that thousands of Russians marched on the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, not to topple the Tsar, but to simply give him a petition. Someone panics, shooting starts, and before you know it, there has been a massacre by the palace guards. The country starts to seem to fall apart. The Tsar and the people around him, they panic.
He wasn't great enough to lead such a big country at a time of troubles. He was a good father and good husband, but we do evaluate leaders not by how good they are in their small families, but how good they used to be with regard to the whole nation.
Amidst this, the Russian people began to see the Tsar and his family as something of a circus, making other royals round the world shudder. With his unpopular German wife, Alexandra, and the increasingly influential Rasputin. A Russian mystic and self-proclaimed holy man who appeared to have an extraordinary hold on the inner circle.
Nicholas was frankly bad enough as a Tsar. The fact that he had an overbearing German-born wife at a time when actually the Russians were going to find themselves facing the Germans as their primary antagonists did not help. The fact that also, especially under pressure from his wife, Nicholas for so long countenanced this sort of charlatan Rasputin and his various dissolute antics around the court. Dissolute antics that everyone read about enthusiastically in all kinds of sort of yellow papers. Again, contributed to this sense that this is a Tsar who not only is out of touch and not on the side of the people, but is actively harboring hostile forces.
The Tsarina became dependent on Rasputin. Rumors started to circulate. There was more to their relationship than met the eye. She allegedly wrote, "How difficult it is to conquer one's bad habits. But you will help me. You will not leave me. For I am weak and love you, and have faith in you alone."
This was a family issue that really influenced negatively how state affairs panned out. A weak Tsar, over-reliant on this one particular advisor, somehow let everything slip.
But the royal soap opera was to become deadly when Nicholas made the decision to take supreme command of the armed forces as Russia entered the First World War. With an estimated 2 million deaths, once again, the Russian people would have their loyalty severely tested. And for the first time in centuries of Tsarist rule, they had reached their breaking point. What would happen next would become one of the biggest events of the 20th century.
The revolutionary fire of the masses was finally unleashed.
Moscow. It's one of the world's largest cities. It is grand, glittering, and utterly imposing. And it's meant to be. This is a monument to the global ambitions of its leaders, past and present. Over the last 1,000 years, this has been a country defined by its all-powerful rulers. And yet, for all its grand cities and decadent leadership, in 1917, there was to be a political earthquake that would shake the very core of Russia. The people had had enough. They had faced a devastating war, they were starving, and their loyalty to their leader was spent. Into this power vacuum stepped a man who would trigger one of the biggest political upheavals of the 20th century. But what would be the human cost of a revolution? And what does it really mean to the Russia of today? There is one man who is instantly recognized around the world by just one word: Lenin.
Lenin himself, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, who took that revolutionary code name Lenin, was an extraordinary figure.
Today, if you want to meet Lenin, his embalmed body awaits in a mausoleum at the heart of Red Square. But be prepared to queue. Many people go to pay their respects, not just to the man, but to the ideals he still represents.
He was a man who did believe in an ideology that he thought would ultimately, possibly passing through rivers of blood, but ultimately create this extraordinary world of egalitarianism with no hunger, no want, no oppression.
The vision that Lenin had was very simple: bread, land, and peace, which was an almost universal longing of the Russian people after this disastrous participation in World War I.
And in a Russia at the turn of the century, this resonated with a country on its knees. In February 1917, Russian people and soldiers took to the streets in St. Petersburg, originally as a peaceful demonstration.
So in February to March 1917, there was an enormous upswell of a sense that something had to change, that the political system had become dysfunctional, that the Tsar was no longer listening to what the people wanted. And in February 1917, what we would think of as a popular revolution happened.
It spontaneously grew into a general strike and outright mutiny. After just 7 days, Tsar Nicholas II had abdicated. A provisional government stepped in.
There are all these kind of very excited responses to revolution, which I think can be forgotten in a sense when we think of what came later.
In October, Lenin seized his chance. His followers, known as the Red Guard, captured control in a bloodless coup and put the radical Communist Party, the Bolsheviks, in power. But it launched the country into a civil war.
There continued to be a situation of chaos as each part of Russia and even individuals within Russia decided where their future was to be, or were just caught up by one side or the other and forced to fight in the civil war.
On the one side was Lenin's Bolshevik Red Army, and on the other was the White Army, made up of Tsarist nobles and aristocrats, and no mercy was shown on either side. Tsar Nicholas and his family, who had been put under house arrest in Siberia, were awoken on July 17, 1918, by guards from Lenin's Red Army. The entire family were made to gather in one room and were then brutally shot. The dynasty that had ruled Russia for 3 centuries had come to a horrifying end. And yet, it would not bring peace to the people of Russia. and they were plunged into an ever more brutal chapter.
In 2017, there was a really interesting reimagining of the revolutionary period in Russia. TV programs came out that trashed the legacy of the Bolsheviks and portrayed them as personally morally reprehensible, and the structures that created as being flawed from the start.
In 2017, Putin made it clear that the 100th anniversary of the revolution would not be an occasion for state celebration. He even clamped down on unauthorized rallies. Why? For many, it's the sign of a distinctly anti-revolutionary and deeply apprehensive leader for whom revolution represents a challenge to stability.
The idea of celebrating something which was in any way a kind of mass overthrow of the existing regime is clearly uncomfortable.
For others, it may be because the civil war that followed has given the revolution a darker narrative. The war devastated the country, causing an estimated 14 million deaths. But after 4 long years, it was finally over.
Civil wars rarely end neatly, but pretty much by 1922, the fighting had finished. On the one hand, the Bolsheviks wanted to essentially now move into a nation-building mode. And on the other hand, they wanted to mark their victory. We've won, and we're building a new state, not just a new state, but a new kind of state.
And that new state was created when a treaty between Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasus formed the Union of Soviet Republics. Lenin's vision for a new communist state had arrived. The Soviet Union was born. But would it be the egalitarian paradise Lenin had once promised? The truth was that having demolished the oppressive autocracy of the Tsars, an equally brutal leadership now took their place.
The communist leadership could start experimenting with different means of actually making that state function, but very swiftly defaulting to terror and repression as once again the only way to govern a country like Russia.
Lenin ordered an all-powerful security service into being, called the Cheka, paving the way for what would become the notorious KGB.
The Cheka's function was to protect the fledgling Bolshevik state and actually to destroy class enemies, aristocrats, anti-revolutionaries, people whom Lenin and Trotsky thought posed a sort of existential risk to communism. And their role essentially was, putting it nicely, internal security, but putting it as it was to smash enemies of the state.
Cheka agents exuded terror and control. With his people under that control, Lenin wanted to apply an equally firm hand to the running of the state. He needed to chart a way for his new Soviet Union to recover from years of famine and war. And to do so might mean playing a little fast and loose with his Marxist ideals.
So there's a need to rebuild. And Lenin very, very pragmatically adopts his so-called new economic policy, which is in some ways a limited form of capitalism. The state maintains the so-called commanding heights of the economy, the big heavy industries, the banks and so forth. But on the other hand, the opportunities for small-scale capitalist enterprise, farmers being allowed to grow extra and then sell it in markets.
The communist leaders found that their ideals, their Marxist ideas, were in direct collision with actually managing a functioning state. And so a return to capitalism had to be a stopgap measure to make sure that the country didn't collapse altogether.
And so, a new form of communism was born, one which could be adapted, reinterpreted, and reinvented to meet the needs of this brand new Russia. Its success at doing so would be tested time and time again over the next 70 years, and would come with an extraordinary human cost, especially when placed in the hands of the man who would succeed Lenin. It's fair to say that Russia today has a somewhat mixed relationship with one of its most notorious leaders, Joseph Stalin. And yet, his rehabilitation has gathered pace with a record 70% of Russians in a recent poll approving of his role in Russian history. So who was he? In 1924, the man who had made an indelible mark on the 20th century and changed the fortunes of Russia died. Lenin was gone, and whilst a host of loyal Bolsheviks jostled to take his place, a lesser-known party member was about to surprise them all: Joseph Stalin.
No one beforehand thought it could be conceivable that Stalin would become leader of the Soviet Union.
Lenin himself had advised against Stalin being his successor, but Stalin did become his successor, and this was largely on the basis of taking out opponents.
He could basically ally with one against the other and then ally the other way, play them all off very effectively until there was just one man standing.
In 1929, Stalin became the ruler of the Soviet Union. To the outside world, this was a kindly, benevolent Uncle Joe, a man to look after his fellow comrades.
Then shift to this very radical vision of a great leap forward or a great break away from the new economic policy and towards industrialization, collectivization, class war.
Russia was in for a shock.
Stalin proves that, let's face it, the 20th century was the perfect century for dictators.
The principle of terror, the Red Terror, so-called, of the Civil War, had begun under Lenin, and that there was no difference between Lenin and Stalin when it came to the principle of repressing your enemies in very large numbers.
So the Cheka evolved. Its mission stayed the same, which was to smash enemies of the revolution.
Under Stalin, the Cheka became known as the NKVD.
It was the NKVD who carried out massive repressions in which millions and millions of people were murdered and killed.
This was an era of the knock on the door at 3 in the morning. Someone in your apartment block is being dragged away by the secret police. Everyone just kind of keeps their head down because it could be you next time.
The NKVD was so ruthless that this era became known as the Great Terror. For ordinary Russians across the country, life under Stalin was one ruled by fear.
You couldn't even trust your own family. There was the legend of Pavel Morozov, who was a child who actually informed on his own parents to the secret police. Why? Because they had been hoarding food to feed him at a time of famine. And this is a sense, I think, of the paranoia that became part and parcel of everyone's lives in the 1930s.
Nighttime arrests, large-scale deportations. Obviously, none of this is reported in the press. What we have is a rhetoric of wreckers, enemies of the people.
This was a grievous, terrible period in Soviet history where the secret police were themselves, ironically enough, often consumed, that they would be carrying out these executions, arresting people, often by quota, and then would themselves be shot. Others found out gulags where very many people perished or died constructing canals in the frozen north.
An estimated 18 million people are thought to have been imprisoned in work camps known as the Gulag.
One of Stalin's strengths, in a way, was precisely that he could imagine things on a scale that other people thought was just completely ridiculous. The thought of building labor camps wherein you can have millions of people being sort of imprisoned and being worked, sometimes to death.
Repressing individuals, deporting them to Siberia, murdering them more or less at whim is a constant throughout Russian history. It's just under Stalin it was elevated to an all-pervasive system which affected everybody in the country more or less indiscriminately.
People thought, no, surely it can't be that extreme. If anything, it was more extreme than it was thought.
There are almost no monuments to those who were killed in Stalin's concentration camps, although it's a very important part of Soviet history, but this is a kind of hidden part of the history.
On Stalin's orders, 75% of the Supreme War Council are murdered in 1937. That is, 2 out of 5 marshals, 13 out of 15 army generals. Out of a total of 6,000 high-ranking officers in the Red Army, 1,500 are executed during one purge.
So how and why, in Russia, has Stalin's image been gradually rehabilitated from bloody dictator to an efficient leader? Many have pointed towards a day that has grown into a major celebration of patriotism under the presidency of Vladimir Putin. Victory Day. The story of Stalin's Russia was about to take an extraordinary turn with the arrival of the Second World War. Russia, a country that has never been shy to rewrite its own history, even if it's some way from the truth. And Putin is a master of the craft.
He's plundering history for the bits that fit his current political needs. He can essentially reinvent Russia for every single individual segment of the audience.
And there is one man in particular who appears to be having his legacy reworked for the next generation.
Under Putin, Stalin has made something of a comeback. History has been rewritten to the point where he's now portrayed in Russian textbooks for kids as an efficient manager.
So how could the man, who some estimate was responsible for the death of as many as 20 million Soviets, now be remembered as a Russian hero? In 1939, perhaps 2 of the greatest villains of modern history, Stalin and Hitler, had initially entered a pact. The Soviets would help Germany in return for Poland. But Stalin was double-crossed. Within 2 years, Hitler scrapped the pact, and the Soviets found themselves facing the Nazi war machine. Hitler attacked on the 22nd of June, 1941, and so began a bloody war on the Eastern Front.
The German troops crossed the Soviet border, and thereafter follows a long period of tremendously traumatic retreats, huge loss of life.
After 5 months, the Nazis closed in on St. Petersburg, which had been renamed Leningrad, beginning a siege of the historic city. It would last 2.5 years and go down as one of the deadliest blockades in history.
The Siege of Leningrad, of course, has become a kind of iconic part of Soviet history. I mean, people were reduced sometimes to cannibalism. I mean, people were starving.
More people died in the defense of the Leningrad than the total British, American, and French war dead through the entire war.
It is a moment in history that almost defines the sacrifice that ordinary Russians would make for the victory of their country. The loss of generations on a heartbreaking scale. And yet, it was indeed a huge turning point. Eventually, the war on the Eastern Front fell in the Soviets' favor.
It's very difficult, I think, to get to terms with just how vicious the struggle on the Eastern Front was. And when it comes down to it, Hitler's war machine was broken in the East. That's where the majority of his divisions were deployed. That's where the majority of his divisions were destroyed.
For the remainder of the war, the Germans were attacked from all sides by the Allies and were never able to regain the initiative. Then, on the 8th of May, 1945, came the announcement everyone had been waiting for.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, signed the act of unconditional surrender.
The war had been won at a huge cost to the Soviet Union. An estimated 26 million Soviet citizens lost their lives.
If you go to Leningrad, well, as is now St. Petersburg, the massive Piskarovskaya cemetery, all you see is mass grave after mass grave after mass grave.
The fact that Russia lost that many at the time of the Second World War is, to a large extent, explained by the fact that Russian military commanders and Stalin did not economize on human lives. In my case, I've not seen both my grandparents, and it's not my unique family story, it's almost everywhere.
But despite this extraordinary cost, without the Soviet Union, the Second World War would have ended very differently. The Allies emerged victorious and more powerful than ever before.
The Soviet Union bought global freedom with Soviet soldiers' blood, almost that the world owes that victory to the ultimate sacrifice that Soviet soldiers, that the Soviet people as a whole were willing to make.
Which is why, even in the height of a pandemic, Putin decided that commemorating this moment in history with his Victory Day parade was what the country needed. It's a symbol of strength, of Russian might, of a turning point in the fortunes of the motherland.
This is the thing that distinguishes the Soviet participation in war from any other countries, that it's on a completely different scale, and that this deserves to be commemorated on a world stage.
And so just when Russia could have looked at its weakest, they were suddenly at their strongest. Stalin was transformed, and there was a new empire to build.
Stalin was not by nature a humanitarian nor an altruist, and he had fought the Second World War to preserve his country, and he was likely also going to use this as an opportunity to extend his power as much as possible. Soviet armies had penetrated deep into Europe, all the way through to Berlin and so forth. And basically what happened was that where Soviet troops had reached, on the whole, there are some exceptions, but on the whole, they would not withdraw.
With the agreements made at the Yalta Conference in 1945, Stalin was able to expand the Soviet Empire. New satellite states emerged in Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Albania, and East Germany. This became known as the Eastern Bloc. Stalin had succeeded in turning the fledgling communist state into a giant force to be reckoned with, and it made the West very uneasy. The most notorious chapter in Russian history was about to begin. Over the last 1,000 years, the Russian people have seen their history defined, in part by their tumultuous relationship with the West. It's fitting that their national symbol is that of the double-headed eagle, one facing east and one west. It's been said that if in Asia you feel European and in Europe you feel Asian, that means you are Russian. This double identity stands Russians out in the world.
The great power identity is something that's been very important during Russian Empire, during the Soviet period, and in the contemporary time. That claim just isn't plausible. Russia is nothing like the Soviet Union was.
Russia isn't equal. It's not economically equal. It hasn't got Silicon Valley. It's decaying. And yet, this is the kind of imperial fantasy that Russia and the US are co-superpowers in conflict with one another.
That getting along with Russia is a good thing, not a bad thing.
And yet, for the Russian people, this conflict feels very real. For a generation of Russians, this hostility to the West is all too familiar, thanks to an era when Russia didn't want to just measure itself against the West. It wanted to beat it. An era of spies, lies, and an ever-looming threat of nuclear annihilation. In 1946, the now former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill made a speech which is considered one of the opening volleys of the Cold War.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. All these cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere.
After 4 years of pretending that this was benign Uncle Joe Stalin who was on their side, suddenly they had to explain the true nature of the Soviet regime once it was becoming clear in its domination of Eastern Europe. What had been presented as a friend was now undeniably an enemy and the greatest threat.
And with this threat came the looming fear of a new global conflict. Who knew where Stalin and his Soviets would stop?
The leaders of Russia tell us their only concern is the defense of their own nation. Is this so? Or are they ambitious for world conquest?
Stalin was now at the peak of his power, or at least Stalin's Soviet Union was at the peak of its power, and it was looking to expand.
The moment of no return had passed. There was a new global order. It was East versus West, communism versus capitalism, with each side determined to outplay the other.
They secretly funded communist parties in Europe, in France, in Spain, even in the US. They supported leftist leaders in Africa and Latin America.
The Cold War wasn't really cold for much of its history. This was a real fight. There were small, nasty wars around the world as each side vied for influence. Some of the biggest ones, of course, were Korea, were Vietnam.
But just as distrust and hostility with the West hit an all-time high, Russia was about to lose the man who had driven it all.
By the end of his life, Stalin was, ironically, on the one hand, absolutely untouchable politically, and on the other, more paranoid than at any point in his existence. But of course, he died in a way that obviously was a victim of his own paranoia, that, when he had a brain aneurysm, because his guards were told that no one could disturb him, he lay dying and wasn't able to actually get medical assistance until it was far too late.
This person who had been presented for so many years as superhuman, immortal, the person on whom absolutely all Soviet life rested, had suddenly gone, was an enormous shock. What could possibly come after Stalin?
The man of steel was gone, but Russia was about to enter an even more deadly chapter. In just under 10 years after his death, the USSR and the West would reach the brink of an all-out nuclear war. The Cold War was about to get even colder. "1950s Russia, new leader Nikita Khrushchev had skillfully seized power after Stalin's death. The country was in the grip of the Cold War, and information was king. If you knew what your enemies were up to, you could stay one step ahead.
The KGB had a specialist disinformation department. They did all sorts of dirty tricks. They would plant fake stories, they would forge letters.
Almost every major world event has been manipulated, affected, or changed by intelligence. The Soviets operated under the old Chinese concept. To win a war without a battle, that's the acme of any foreign operation.
And key to that operation was a newly developed secret service. Out went the military thugs enforcing power. And in came a new and far more sophisticated KGB.
They were the guys who were posh, who spoke foreign languages without accents, who were sophisticated, and who kind of roamed the world trying to subvert the capitalist West.
The Soviets are attempting to intimidate the Western powers. This is a dangerous tactic.
We're very familiar with James Bond, with MI6, with the CIA, but actually the KGB had a pretty good run in the whole post-war era, not least because they were helped by a bunch of clever, posh, Cambridge-educated traitors, or double agents you could call them, people like Kim Philby, who were in positions of influence shipping British and American secrets to Moscow.
I'm debarred by the Official Secrets Act from saying anything that might disclose to unauthorized persons information derived from my position as a former government official.
And there was one area of intelligence gathering and espionage that was of special interest to Russia. The West had been the first to develop nuclear weapons, and the Russians wanted in.
I thought that perhaps some of what I had access to might be useful in helping Russia to keep abreast of Britain, America, and Germany.
At the age of 20, Melita Norwood worked as a secretary for one of Britain's top-secret nuclear research centers, where she began to photograph classified files for the KGB.
Perhaps the most important female agent in the KGB's long history, she had never been confronted with the evidence of her career as a spy until the BBC secretly filmed her.
The West wanted Russia defeated. I didn't want them defeated.
Melita seemingly lived an unremarkable life in Bexley Heath, but would go down in history as the longest-serving Soviet spy in Britain, and helped to take Russia one step closer to what it longed to be, a nuclear superpower.
The Soviet government's announcement that it has decided to resume nuclear tests comes as a profound shock. Once again, the iron fist of the Soviet Union has crushed the hopes of peace-loving people.
The Soviets, under the leadership of Khrushchev, had been testing and developing atomic bombs, and in 1961, in the Russian Arctic, they tested the largest nuclear weapon ever to be detonated, the Tsar Bomba. It produced the most powerful human-made explosion ever recorded. It was designed to make the world sit up and notice, and they did.
As he said he would, Mr. Khrushchev has exploded his giant bomb in cynical disregard of the United Nations. They have advanced no solid justification for exploding this monstrous and unnecessary weapon.
It was obvious that the Soviet Union needed to have some kind of thermonuclear capacity in order to deter the West. This particular case, the Tsar Bomba, really reflects that. It had very, very little military value, but it had a great deal of psychological value.
For the first time in its centuries of squaring up to the West, Russia finally wielded as devastating a power as its enemies, and it looked utterly capable of deploying it.
There are two kinds of attack, with warning and without any warning. We think that most of the time we will be warned before the bomb explodes, so there will be time for us to get into our homes, schools, or some other safe place.
So what was to happen next would be a defining moment in the story of modern Russia. In 1962, the stakes were raised to a war footing when Russia attempted to place its shiny new nuclear missiles within a stone's throw of the United States in Fidel Castro's Cuba.
A victorious revolutionary enters Havana in triumph. He promises his people freedom. Instead, he gives them bondage as Russia's first satellite in the Caribbean. In one giant step, Russia is giving Cuba an offensive nuclear capability that can strike at the heart of the United States.
The world held its breath.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
But at the very last hour, Kennedy and Khrushchev managed to come to an agreement.
On Sunday morning, a message reaches the White House from Moscow. Press Secretary Salinger announces that Chairman Khrushchev has agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba.
The Cuban Missile Crisis really highlighted Khrushchev's style of leadership, which was he was impulsive and unpredictable. Khrushchev essentially brought the country to the brink of war.
America and the West would be ingrained as the enemy of the state for generations of Russians to come. And with Russia's relationship with the West today at an all-time low, and with defense budgets at an all-time high, you could easily be fooled into thinking that the Cold War never went away. But the truth is far more complicated. The tale of Russia between the Cold War and now is one of remarkable twists and turns. By the 1980s, Russia would be about to face an extraordinary moment in its history. One that would not only see the end of the Cold War, it would see the end of the Soviet Union. The story of the Russian people over the last millennium is often one of extraordinary hardship and sacrifice on behalf of a country forever racing to catch up with the world around it. But during the Cold War, she had finally emerged as a nuclear-powered global superpower to rival the United States. The Russian-dominated Soviet Union encompassed 15 republics with control over 293 million people. And yet, in just a matter of decades, the world's most powerful collection of states would dramatically implode. So what happened? For many people, the end of the USSR began on the 26th of April, 1986, in a town called Pripyat.
Hello, very good morning to you. You're watching the BBC's Breakfast Time programme. This morning, nuclear experts are assessing the extent and the dangers of what's being described as the world's worst ever nuclear disaster in the short history of civilian nuclear power.
At the time of the accident, it was really the peak of the Soviet society. Things were going very well, they're generating nuclear power, really at the height of modernity. It was a normal day in Pripyat. Workers went to the power station as usual. Families did their regular things. At the unit, reactor number 4 was scheduled a safety test. It was a routine safety test that needed to be completed for use of the reactor. And a number of things went wrong during this safety test, which led to the accident that we know of and the explosion that ripped off the lid of the nuclear reactor, sending radioactive particles into the local area, and a fire that burned for 10 days, spreading a huge cloud of radioactivity, not only over the city of Pripyat, but also over the whole of Europe. And this was really disastrous.
At first, the Soviets tried to suppress the accident. They thought the panic would be worse than radiation if there was an evacuation. Phone lines were cut in the town to prevent anyone from telling the outside world. Life must go on.
They were allowed to go about their daily business, going to shops and going out and about, even while there was radiation all around them.
And it wasn't just the local residents exposed to lethal doses of radioactivity. Hundreds, then thousands, and then finally hundreds of thousands of workers were sent to the disaster zone.
This was really a disaster that nobody had ever seen before and never really imagined at this scale. So they had to develop new types of technologies and approaches to put out the fire, including using a helicopter to dump sand and boron onto the nuclear reactor fire.
Teams, dubbed liquidators, raced to contain the exposed core, with soldiers taking turns to run onto the roof of the reactor to shovel off radioactive matter. The radiation was so high they could only stay up there for 90 seconds, but even in that time, they received a lifetime dose of radiation. Meanwhile, one helicopter fatally clipped a crane, killing all 4 men on board.
Eventually, after 10 days of burning, it went out. The radioactive lava that was seeping down through the building had to be dealt with. They didn't want it to reach the ground below the reactor and hit any groundwater where it may have created another explosion.
Miners were enlisted and tunneled 90 feet under the melted core to build a protective wall.
The real concern was that it would hit the water table and that drinking water in the local area would be contaminated. So the release of this radioactivity was really bad news for people specifically near the reactor, but also those people who came into contact with the particles that were released into the atmosphere.
Finally, as international pressure mounted, 44,500 residents were evacuated from Pripyat. Over the following 2 weeks, they relocated another 75,000 more people from the surrounding 18-mile area, labeled the Zone of Alienation. Those in most danger were moved, but the radioactive cloud spread across vast areas of Europe.
The extent of the fire at Chernobyl and all the radioactive particles contained in it was really vast, and it went very high up into the atmosphere.
The wind took the radioactive particles around Belarus and Ukraine, up to Sweden and Finland. It then looped down all the way to Italy and then back up across the UK to Sweden and Norway. This was a global disaster. And still, the Soviet Union did not warn people to stay indoors during the emergency.
The fact that the rest of the world knew about what had happened at Chernobyl, that there'd been an explosion well before the Soviet population heard about it. People realized that actually the state didn't really care about its own people enough to protect them.
They were doing as much as possible in order to keep this under the carpet.
This was a failure of the entire state apparatus.
They were trying to do their best in order to hide everything.
Soviet officials announced to the world they had put out the fire on the 6th of May, but radioactive gases poured from the explosion site for another week, peaking on the 11th of May.
The Reagan team confirmed world concern of what they claim is the Kremlin's continuing refusal to come clean on the accident.
We don't think that they have provided as full and prompt information as they should have.
For those in power, admitting responsibility meant admitting that the image of the great Soviet Union was a lie. The radioactivity released was 400 times greater than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And the long-lasting effects on the health of the people exposed, particularly children, is still being realized over 30 years on.
It could happen in other parts of the world, but reaction would be different. And this did manifest this kind of approach of authorities, of the government, toward ordinary Russians, and their eagerness to pay any price in terms of our lives.
The fact that it failed so catastrophically and spread radiation across the entire country, something that people were very afraid of, really shattered the illusion of the Soviet dream.
It brought home how necessary it was to tell the truth and to reveal not just contemporary Soviet problems, but to delve into all the lies that had been told about Soviet history beforehand.
The disaster would have a profound effect on the relationship between the Soviet Union and her people. It was a loss of faith that still has a ripple effect today. 70 years on from Lenin's glorious revolution, 40 years on from Stalin's victory in the Second World War, and only decades from the heady heights of the Cold War, and the first chink in the armor of the mighty Soviet Union had been broadcast to the world. For almost 1,000 years, from Ivan the Terrible all the way through to Vladimir Putin, Russia has had a complicated relationship with the concept of freedom. But at the end of the 1980s, the arrival of a new leader would usher in an autonomy the people had never experienced before, and Russia would never be the same again. After years of dormant Soviet rule, the Russian people were about to find out what freedom meant with the arrival of Mikhail Gorbachev.
Gorbachev was not very well known at the time, but he understood about the need for innovation.
He manages to win the leadership contest in 1985 and then very quickly starts to instigate one of the most radical reform programs that the Soviet Union has ever seen.
After almost 40 years of conflict, Gorbachev signed a nuclear arms treaty with the US that ended the Cold War.
He's exceedingly successful in international terms in basically ending this very, very confrontational era. But domestically, he's only beginning to realize just how massive a challenge trying to reform what really proves to be a pretty unreformable system is going to be.
Gorbachev's roadmap for change was packaged around two buzzwords: glasnost, which meant openness, and perestroika, which meant a restructuring. It appeared as if ordinary Russians had finally been given the right to use their own voice.
What we're seeing is throughout the Soviet Union, different nationality groups speak out in a way we haven't really seen since the time of the revolution itself.
It was the most beautiful time. This was real freedom and opportunity for Russia to be changed. It was like life might be different.
The problem was that as soon as Gorbachev loosened restrictions on what could be said publicly in Russia, there was a great deal that could be said and not much of it was good.
And so, his newly empowered citizens made their feelings known.
He leans into it. He thinks, well, okay, we do need to have more dramatic change. Then what we get is demokratizatsiya, democratization.
In 1989, Gorbachev introduced free elections. It was a momentous departure from the old communist system.
Ultimately, it is the people who will decide the fate of Gorbachev's revolution.
How much faith do you have in Gorbachev?
He's on the right track. We just have to make sure everyone listens to him.
Gorbachev had opened the floodgates. Across the Soviet Union, a dramatic wave of revolution spread. Then, on the 9th of November 1989, the Berlin Wall came crashing down. For the hardliners of the Communist Party, this was a leader who had lost control.
Gorbachev's challenge had always been how to deal with the hardliners that he knew still controlled the so-called power agencies, the military, the police, the KGB. Once again, sort of become more radical. Then, okay, well, what we're going to do is create a new union treaty, which is going to totally reshape the basis of the Soviet Union. And this would also mean, frankly, the end of the Unified Communist Party, the end of the KGB. This was too much from the point of view of the hardliners. They felt that if they allowed this union treaty to be signed, there was no going back. And that's why we had, in August 1991, their coup.
A reactionary group led by the KGB locked Gorbachev in his Crimean estate, and on the 19th of August 1991 sent tanks into Moscow in a bid to seize power.
They just thought, look, they would isolate Gorbachev in his palace, his dacha down in Crimea. They would have the tanks out on the streets and declare sort of a temporary emergency committee would be in charge. And they assumed that, frankly, as soon as they cracked the whip, the people of the Soviet Union would basically just settle down, which they didn't.
The KGB wanted to hold together the old communist USSR regime, but the people fought back.
They're beginning to claim Moscow as their own. Claiming it back from the communists, whose credibility has been destroyed, whose power has been crushed by these demonstrators.
The crowds took on almost the feel of a carnival, that they would put flowers in tank barrels, climb up onto the tanks in the streets of Moscow.
As soon as it became clear that the protesters could get away with protesting, that, yes, there were tanks, but frankly, protesters could clamber all over them and no one was going to shoot them, then all of a sudden everything shifted. It became this symbol of the time when they, the elites, the bosses, tried to control us, and for once we said no. It became a revolution.
This was the defining moment. The people had spoken. The coup was over, but nothing would be the same again. They not only rejected the hardliners, but also the broken communist system presided over by Gorbachev. On Christmas Day, 1991, he stepped down as the 8th and last ever leader of the Soviet Union.
Mikhail Gorbachev, although he has played a great role in the world history, did start things he was not able to control. This huge geopolitical catastrophe, disintegration of the USSR.
At the end of 1991, as his very last act as Soviet president, Gorbachev signed the Soviet Union out of existence.
Mikhail Gorbachev inherited an empire maintained by the iron fist of central control. He's leaving behind 15 independent states, which share only a disastrous economy and an uncertain future.
Power passed from the Kremlin to 15 new republics, and over 6 decades of communist rule came to an abrupt end.
This was a truly astonishing and momentous event. The end of the Soviet Union, the rise of a new independent Russia.
The Russian public has decreed Gorbachev's dissolution of the Soviet Union as a disaster bordering on treason. In a recent poll of Russians, his approval rating stood well below even that of Stalin. For many, the new Russia would bring with it an era of hardship and uncertainty. But for a select few, the journey from communism to capitalism would see them become filthy rich and herald in the era of one Vladimir Putin, the unlikely leader.
He was a kind of junior officer in communist East Germany in the 1980s.
He was never, though, a star. He was a good B-. He was everybody's favorite second-in-command.
So how did he go from a good number 2 to allegedly one of the richest and most powerful men on the planet? Life for ordinary people in modern Russia today is dominated by one man, and he's everywhere you look. Over the last 1,000 years, Russia's history has constantly returned to one of East versus West, and today is no different.
Vladimir Putin is a man with a mission. And bear in mind his background. He is KGB through and through.
He is a man who has mastered 2 martial arts.
Putin is kind of Russia's own action man. So there's the judo, he genuinely likes judo, but also there are all sorts of other crazy stunts. He's flown with cranes, he's scuba dived in the Mediterranean, there's that famous shot of him riding topless on a horse.
He's believed to secretly be one of the wealthiest men in the world.
It's possible to say that Putin is the richest man in the world, probably the richest man who has ever lived.
And has dominated Russian politics since he was first elected 20 years ago.
You know, he's this virile, strong guy. And it was a symbol of personal virility, but also of Russia as a strong, virile state.
Who is he? What does he want? And what is the real story of Russia today? After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Boris Yeltsin had come to power as Russia's first president. But his attempts to bring in democracy and a capitalist market economy had resulted in huge economic hardship for the Russian people.
Prices had jumped even more than the 3, 4 or 5 times they'd expected. This butter was selling for 8 times the price it could have been bought for yesterday. These are the sort of sums that make nonsense of the incomes of most Russians.
The weakness of the ruble meant that your pension could mean almost nothing, where you had no idea what your job was going to be. The struggle for day-to-day survival was extraordinary.
I simply can't survive on a pension, declared one man. It's daylight robbery, stealing from the honest, complained another.
By the late 1990s, he had suffered a string of heart attacks. He withdrew from public life, and Russia was left spinning out of control. And lurking in the shadows was an obscure politician called Vladimir Putin.
He comes to Moscow. He becomes director of the Federal Security Service, the FSB, which is sort of the closest thing there is to a successor to the KGB. And then he becomes, in due course, deputy prime minister and prime minister. And by this point, he's clearly been picked. But that's it. He's picked because he's seen as efficient, young, unlike Boris Yeltsin, sober, but also, more to the point, reliable. He's a safe pair of hands, someone who you can trust.
On December 31st, 1999, with the dawn of a new millennium, Putin came into power.
Putin looked fit, looked healthy, sober, and competent. Putin has always based his claim to authority on being able to establish order, some kind of regularity, some kind of predictability. And he's very much made his name on being able to maintain order both within Russia and in Russia's relations with the outside world.
During the 2000s, Russia began to change dramatically.
If you were lucky, if you had the right connections or the right muscle, you could become a millionaire, a billionaire.
The economy boomed, the rich became richer, and Putin's popularity soared. Russia is rife with oil, selling up to 11 million barrels a day.
Russia has been more prosperous. The standard of living in Russia has been better than it has ever been.
Today, it has more than 70 billionaires. There was a new, flashy breed of oligarch who had cashed in under Yeltsin.
You had a whole series of auctions, and people were buying whole industries for pence on the pound.
They control oil, they control gas, they control minerals, they control railways, natural resources, and they have grown stupendously rich.
But the oligarchs were in for a shock with Putin.
What he was worried about when he came into power in 2000 was that oligarchs had large amounts of money which he didn't really control. And so what he did in his first presidential term was rein in some of the oligarchs and essentially say, stay out of politics, obey the state, or I will take your fortune away. Now, some of them ran away. Some of them were jailed. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once Russia's richest man, who spent 10 years in a Siberian jail. And others said, OK, that's fine. What is mine is yours. And if you look at the people who are now billionaires in today's Russia, they are some of the wealthiest people on the planet. They're not just billionaires, they're multi-billionaires. And it's Kremlin Inc. It's corporatist. And actually these days, it's all KGB.
The big question is, does the power and money really sit with Putin or with the KGB?
You can't be ex-KGB. You can't. Because it's the system what kept you forever. And of course, Putin can't be ex. When Putin became prime minister, his first meeting was with very high-rank KGB and officers. And it was a joke. He said operation was successful.
We have in Russia exceedingly sophisticated and well-funded and frankly very powerful range of intelligence agencies, which are both suppressing people within the country, but also, as we all know, carry out all kinds of missions around the world.
In 2006, Russia passed new laws permitting the special forces to carry out extrajudicial killings of extremists abroad. And there was one mission in particular that would define this next chilling chapter of Putin's reign. An assassination that would leave a grieving widow demanding answers.
In Russia, it's very common to use different names. Normally, I called him Sasha, of course, and all friends knew him as Sasha, because it's more softer, it's more lovely. It's a very interesting connection between Putin and my husband, Sasha.
Her husband was ex-KGB officer Alexander Litvinenko, who had fled Russia with his family after becoming an enemy of the Kremlin for speaking out against corruption.
Maybe he's what they call betraying of a system. Maybe because he was very close to some truth.
On the 1st of November 2006, Litvinenko met two men at the Millennium Hotel in London, where he enjoyed a pot of green tea. Little did he know his tea had been deliberately contaminated with a deadly poison, polonium-210.
The story is gruesome and yet darkly funny that the two assassins sent by Moscow were not very good killers. They left this billowing trail of radiation all across London.
They go on to contaminate restaurants, bedrooms, a pole dancing club, even Arsenal's Emirates Stadium.
Scotland Yard is convinced that Andrei Lugovoy, a former Russian security services officer, murdered Litvinenko.
It was my right to call for inquest and try to find who behind it. We received this right for public inquiry. But I'm very disappointed.
The killers of Alexander Litvinenko are both back in Russia. Andrei Lugovoy, who co-poisoned Litvinenko, is a Duma deputy. He's like an MP. He's very rich. He appears on state TV chat shows all the time. He protests his innocence. It's clear that they enjoy state protection.
I'm not in a political case. I'm a woman who lost her husband, and I want to know what happened.
Litvinenko's death and the Salisbury poisonings in 2018 demonstrated to the world Russia will use extrajudicial force overseas to protect its interests. But to what end? What does Putin want his new Russia to become? For his people, the message is he's making Russia great again.
In his speeches, Putin was saying Russia is a great power. And the West are not treating Russia as if it's a great power, the way he understands it, which means they get away with the odd little war or invasion and that kind of thing. That's what a great power does. If one of these countries looks like it's getting out of hand, then something has to be done about it.
The world has seen Russia deploy its military strength and might in the Ukraine, Crimea, and in Syria. But to understand Russia today is to understand a different kind of war. A war by stealth.
What the digital world has done has allowed Putin and his spies to reach millions of people, Americans, Brits, with fake stories, with polarizing stories, with all sorts of divisive stuff. The playbook is the same, but the reach now is so much greater, which in some ways makes Putin's regime and Putin's FSB more scary than the KGB. It's clever, and it's brutal, and I don't think we have got to grips with it yet.
It is alleged special intelligence centers infiltrate the internet, hack information systems, and churn out fake news.
What they do, what they are very good at, is identifying the existing fault lines that are thrown up between communities or people who feel they've been left out or whatever. So in some ways, we give them the ammunition that they use against us.
We generally hear about information warfare as something that comes from Russia and is directed at us. The funny thing is, in Russia, information warfare is taken to be what the West does to undermine Russia in the international environment.
And today, accusations of election meddling are just one of the latest iterations of information warfare.
Recent disclosures of alleged hacked emails are consistent with the methods and motivations of Russian-directed efforts. The intelligence community has concluded that they're almost certainly directed by senior Russian government officials. Russia was interested in destabilizing the U.S. political system.
But for now, there is a new story to be spun.
He has brought Russia up from its knees. He's kind of brought pride back.
Over time, he has become more and more isolated, more and more insulated from the realities on the ground.
It remains true that, you know, for many ordinary Russians, other leadership is difficult to imagine.
The big problem for Putin is, ironically enough, the same problem that other dictators and indeed mafia bosses have, is how do you retire when everything you are, everything you have, is based on power?
And it looks neatly, as if the history of Russia over the last 1,000 years almost comes full circle. From its founding father, Prince Vladimir, to the father of Russia today, Vladimir Putin. Its size and power makes Russia a baffling place, full of contradictions. But the truth is, this is a country with a rich, vivid history, and a people who have a unique connection and belief in their motherland, one that has been tested to the extreme by its earliest rulers to its mighty Soviet ambitions. And now, with Putin securing new amendments that could keep him in power until 2036, the next chapter in the roller coaster history of the Russian people looks set to be just as dramatic.
Next week, the story of a homegrown colossus desperate to prove himself to his father, Churchill. Beginnings is brand new next Friday at 9. Next tonight on Channel 5 and My5, one of Mother Russia's modern-day battles and the conspiracies of the Cold War files. Stay with us.